What if the debanking of Nigel Farage is merely a symptom of a much broader philosophical issue and battle in our society? I'm joined today by Southbank Investment Research's Investment Director, John Butler. Now, for those of you who don't know, Southbank Investment Research is the publisher of Fortune and Freedom, amongst many other newsletters, and it is John's role to make sure that our investment analysis is sound. That being said, he messaged the editorial team a rather philosophical analysis the other day, which I wanted to bring to everyone's attention for a very simple reason. It's easy to think that the debanking of Nigel Farage is an isolated issue or some sort of specific thing that has happened that, while extraordinary, is something that will go away. But John's philosophical analysis points out that this is part of a much bigger ideological debate that's been going on for rather a long time. His message featured Aristotle and Plato and Benthamites and Fabians and all sorts of people. So I think that if people understand that context, they'll realize that this is merely the symptom of a much broader issue and that this battle is ongoing and that perhaps the front in this battle has shifted and perhaps even the edge in who is winning it has changed. So, John, before we dig into all of that philosophical side of things, let's just quickly address whether or not you were surprised by what's happened to Nigel, because you were a banker, an investment banker, and although you didn't work in the private banking side of things, you did know people who do. My real question here is whether something has changed since you left banking, and really whether you're surprised by what's happened.
I think there's been an ongoing evolution that you have already mentioned that has affected all major industries to some degree. And it has to do, of course, with image management and virtue signaling in various ways, some of which I think is entirely harmless and well-intentioned. I mean, why wouldn't a company want to be perceived positively by its existing and potential customers? However, what's happened in more recent years is really aggressive advocacy of causes which in some cases are very, very young, and the underlying sort of raison d'etre and belief of some of these movements is questionable to many, and so they become somewhat controversial, but they're also trendy. And it seems to me that corporations seeking, as they always do to some extent, seeking to differentiate themselves are ever quicker at jumping upon these trends and trying to use them as ways, in many cases, to reach new demographics, to reach younger customers, to reach the so-called millennials, Gen Z, call it whatever you like. And so that it's really just ramped up a level. But now we see it shifting from embracing new ways to show your virtue and reach new customers to shunning, perhaps, those customers with whom you're not comfortable being associated. Now, those two are not philosophically the same. And this is why I brought up Aristotle and Plato. They're actually they follow on a very old philosophical dispute, which has to do with fundamental human rights.
Yeah, this is the crucial distinction, isn't it? It doesn't sound like an important distinction, but history has shown that it is extremely important. Even in the fate of nations, you mentioned the Constitution of the US and France in your analysis. So let's go through this message that you sent. We'll start with, I'm going to read all of it, but we're going to take it in bits and pieces here, and so you can explain a bit more details. For those of you who don't remember their high school, university philosophics lecturers' content. What's happening here is a clash between negative and positive rights. Negative rights are what you are not allowed to do. Positive rights are those that you are expected or required to provide or do or be provided by the government. So take us through that. What does that distinction mean? Perhaps we need some examples here.
Yes, basically negative rights are absolute and individual and only have to do with what you are not allowed to do to other individuals. There is no requirement to act in a certain way. However, there are requirements to not act in certain ways. For example, you are not allowed to initiate violence. You are not allowed to seize other people's property. You are not allowed, basically, to do anything that infringes on their, let's face it, we generally accept this, universal right to life, liberty, property, and pursuit of happiness and self-interest. Okay, that's the negative side. And the U.S. Declaration of Independence and Constitution, in part, are absolutely positively, negative rights documents. They really don't reference positive rights at all. Positive rights are different. Positive rights are rights that confer upon you some benefit, but that benefit must be provided by someone else. So whether it's made explicit or not, there is an implicit requirement forcing someone to act in a certain way in order to confer that benefit on someone else. And to conflate the two and to confuse the two is actually extremely, I would say, not only misleading, but it's dangerous. It results in people embracing, let's say, a given political movement, thinking that it's going to protect them, protect their rights, but it ends up forcing them to behave in ways that might make them or others feel uncomfortable.
A good distinction here is on the issue of women on corporate boards, on company boards. A negative rights issue, but you cannot discriminate against women in your selection of who is a board member or not. And the positive right would be a quota for a minimum number of women on the board. In other words, one forces you to do something and one forces you to not do something, not impinge on someone else. Another key example is the US, I think it's Declaration of Independence, references the pursuit of happiness, not happiness in and of itself. Because if the government was required to make people happy, that would be very different to not interfering in people's attempt to become happy. Again, positive and negative right distinction. Let's move on then, because the history of governments and politics and philosophy is largely a battle between these two different ways of seeing the world, even when we don't quite realize it, which is what I think has happened in this story here. You write, classical liberalism only recognizes the former, meaning negative rights, as legitimate and also essential to human liberty. The rights given to us by a creator, as per the US Constitution, or by the French Constitution, by that matter. Modern liberalism argues that in order to realize specific policy goals, the former can be modified or sacrificed entirely as necessary to achieve the goal, i.e. the ends justify the means. So let's take us through how that's applied here in this story of what's going on in not just Nigel's debanking, but in the broader situation.
Well, yes. So what ends up happening is this idea that was first postulated, well, maybe not first postulated, but was really championed by the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He had this idea that in a society, there was probably a general sense of the right and the good, and so people would naturally go about finding ways to cooperate and serve each other's interests, not just be entirely self-interested in their behavior, much in the way a modern sort of free commercial system should operate. We all need to trade, we all need to interact in order to go about, as you say, pursuing our happiness. But Rousseau went one dangerous step further. He believed that it was okay for an enlightened government with a sense of purpose, making people happy, to force people to be free. That is, if you were not willing to go along with society's general attempts to improve itself, the government could compel you to do so. Now, that might seem well-meaning, but you can imagine how that could lead in some very dark directions. For example, the history of fascism and communism in the first half of the 20th century, and also in pockets around the world thereafter. So today, think about this. If your bank accounts, or if your access to utilities, water, electricity, basic life essentials can be switched off because you're not seen as going along with the enlightened society in general, you're at that point, you're completely excluding people's ability to pursue any form of happiness, even if they're trying to remain as isolated and off the grid as they can, because you just can't function without basic utilities and basic banking in the modern world. So that's why we're really on a slippery slope now.
We seem to have no shortage of causes that the government must force us to comply with or to work towards in society. Many of them are considered so important that any sort of dissent is punishable, which is part of what's happened here. One of the things I found very interesting about Nigel's debanking is that it came from the corporate sector, not from the government. So the government, although it had a role in the politically exposed person story, The government didn't say to the banks involved, you shall not bank people who are politically exposed persons, or you shall not bank people who are deemed as racist, or who someone in parliament decides is taking money from the Russian Kremlin or whatever it is. They've made life difficult via corporations instead, and that, I think, is quite a new development, historically speaking, right?
Yes and no. I mean, you'll find examples of this occurring sporadically throughout history. I mean, governments and corporations do interact with one another, but you're seeing it now, as you've put it. It's much more of a blanket social phenomenon now. The government almost sees it as its job to champion these causes and police social commercial interactions as necessary to make sure that people are, as a general rule, moving in this direction. But that's where, again, the water gets very muddy here, because the institution in question, NatWest, in this case, the parent bank of Coutts, is still owned roughly, I think, not quite 40% by the taxpayer. So it's actually not a private institution at all. I mean, it is to an extent, but to another extent, it's not. And so, so for NatWest to try and say, "Oh, this is our decision, this is our business decision," it's like, is it really, when the taxpayer still owns a substantial part of your company? And this can be extended to many, many areas of life where the government is involved, either through ownership or certain forms of regulation or whatever it is. And in the United States, very recently, this has been very, very complicated when it comes to the Supreme Court's recent decision to end racial discrimination in university admissions. And you have, all of these elite universities saying, "Oh, but this is our private decision. If we want to admit people in this way, we can do that." Well, first of all, you could argue the discrimination is simply wrong, but you can also point out all of these elite universities receive huge amounts of money from the government in support of their research, in support of education generally. There's no real such thing as truly private, totally government unfunded education in the United States. It almost doesn't exist. And so it's very, very difficult to claim this protection of, "Oh, we're a private institution" in that context.
I think the stronger argument here, especially in the case of Nigel's debanking, is that you need a bank account to function in today's society precisely because of all the obligations that the government has placed on you. For example, try paying your taxes without a bank account, or trying to keep track of your various tax obligations without a bank account. The government's made that very difficult. And so a bank account is almost a necessity when it comes to complying with the government's rules, and therefore I think it's a bit of a political issue. All right, let's move on. This issue goes all the way back to Plato versus Aristotle. The English tradition is very much Aristotelian, notwithstanding the heavy Platonic influence of the Benthamites and Fabians. So maybe quickly take us through those references.
Well, yes. I mean, the English philosophical tradition, which goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas, and goes back to the early Enlightenment philosophers Hobbes and Locke, was very much a negative rights-based philosophical tradition. English common law, indeed, is based on a very negative rights philosophical set of concepts, treating individuals as individuals, equality before the law, and other more specific applications thereof, such as habeas corpus, and so on and so forth. So the English philosophical tradition really does come out of a negative rights tradition, which ultimately can be traced back to Aristotle and the way he approached philosophy. Whereas on the continent of Europe and in other parts of the world, philosophical traditions in many cases are not particularly Aristotelian, they're more Platonic. And the Platonic tradition is kind of accepting that there is a natural elite in society that is, for whatever reason, just that much smarter and tends towards acquiring that much power. And what Plato was trying to do, and he does this in the Republic, he's trying to demonstrate that that's really the only way society can function in a healthy way that ultimately benefits all. You have to have a process to allow that elite to perform that role without abusing it. And so he tries to find a way to do this in the Republic. But the problem is that if you try to order society that way, elite-driven, top-down, you tend to lose sight of basic individual fundamental human rights when and where they might clash with some element of that top-down effort to order society, again, in ways that might be well-meaning in principle, but we know with what the road to hell is paved. It's paved with good intentions. And so you have to be very wary of things like that. So the English tradition, though, in more modern times, and again, the real push is that of Jeremy Bentham and his followers, the Benthamites, which is utilitarianism. The idea that if we, as experts using science and maths, can solve other people's problems for them, even without their explicit consent, we should do so. That's good. Okay, that's good in their eyes, but to people like me, that's dangerous, right? To allow society to gravitate too far in that direction, if at all.
It's a classic example of what Fortune and Freedom was all about when we started it, which was the idea of taking on the establishment, taking on that metropolitan elite, as Nigel likes to say, and that elite group that think they can govern us better than we can govern ourselves. Let's yank this straight back to what's going on today and right now, because you have an unusual take on what is happening out there. This surprised me anyway. You write that, so the fact that the Aristotelians are making a huge comeback here on various fronts, for example, Brexit, personal freedom, liberty, free speech, etc., should be a huge boon for our business because it gives us something to write about, of course. And we believe in these ideological beliefs. So it stands to reason that if those beliefs are making a comeback by, for example, voting for Brexit and exposing what's going on with Nigel's bank, we're cheering this on and we're in favor of it, and we're in favor of what it means for society. I'm a bit more pessimistic. I think this has merely exposed what's going on. I think the Brexit in name only phenomenon has exposed that we haven't quite won that debate in its entirety. We haven't made the most of Brexit. We haven't gotten rid of any of the EU regulations, such as the politically exposed person regulation. We've uncovered what's going on in the banking sector when it comes to debanking. We've uncovered what's going on in the social media sector to some extent when it comes to censorship. I suspect this is just the tip of the iceberg that our society and economy and financial system is steaming towards. Can you persuade me otherwise?
Well, look, I mean, the very first thing you do if you want to try to deal with the problem is to see the problem for what it is, shine some light on it. And even shining a little light on the tip of an iceberg at least gives you some idea what might be lurking beneath, and you can then set about trying to determine what to do about it. I quote Gandhi's dictum when it comes to situations like this, where you've identified a problem, an oppressive force, something you want to deal with and contest in the world. First they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, and then you win. And that can be a long slog. But the fact that society's kind of having it out with itself now. The culture wars are no longer talked about as some side issue that distracts people from their day-to-day priorities in life. It's in your face 24/7, it seems. And this Nigel Farage banking fiasco is just the latest installment. And what I'm really encouraged to see is that the mainstream press is no longer ignoring it. And indeed, the mainstream press is no longer simply ridiculing it. There's a proper fight now between those who truly believe we should stay on this road and those who truly believe we shouldn't. And yes, you're seeing people dig their heels in, but you've got to have the fight or we're never going to be able to stop this progression down this road to woke serfdom, to paraphrase philosopher Friedrich Hayek.
Yeah, you have cheered me up there. The question is how long in bloody this battle will be. We've had Gandhi, we've had Aristotle, Plato, we've had the founding fathers of the US. We've had Jeremy Bentham, we've had the Fabians, all in one video. Not many people managed to do that on a financial newsletter. I hope people have had some flashbacks to university or high school, and they've discovered that some of the things they learned back then might actually be useful in understanding what's going on. I hope people feel like they're part of a bigger debate that's gone on throughout history, perhaps even, and I hope it's helped them figure out what's going to happen next. John, thanks very much for joining us, and to everyone at home, thanks for watching.
My pleasure, Nick.